it does not answer the questions of equality and even wealth distribution. For Equatorial Guinea, it has a high GDP because of issues with government corruption and unwise or inadequate government spending, leading to an uneven wealth distribution. Just because a country is rich doesn't mean that it is spending the money towards development and improving living standards. For example, a country could be spending its money on supporting a strong army rather than putting money into funding and improvement in the education system. Equatorial Guinea may have rich and developed cities, but it is also inhabited by many different tribal groups. In Equatorial Guinea, most public schools have weak and poor conditions due to problems with resource funding. As a result, private schools are becoming more persistent, and therefore the benefits of economic growth are distributed mainly to those who can afford them, otherwise known as the rich. Finally, the formula for calculating GDP is adding the government spending, the firm's investments, and consumer spending, and finally the exports, while subtracting the imports. In most countries, consumer spending constitutes approximately 70% of the GDP. However, it is totally the opposite in Equatorial Guinea. In this country, 69.8% of the GDP is relied on net exports. 96% of this comes from oil exports. This is quite a high percentage, suggesting that other parts of the GDP equation do not contribute as much. From their HDI, this suggests that their consumer expenditure would be quite low due to their poor living standards.
The HDI is preferred over the GDP as a measure of the progress of a society because it can be constructed for various groups, not just entire countries. When using GDP figures, we cannot see each individual territory or group of people. We can only see the big picture, but in reality, even in the wealthiest of countries, there are areas and groups of people who live in poverty. These groups are not reflected in GDP figures, but can be identified with the HDI.
Though the HDI may be in theory better than the GDP in measuring progress in a society, it is still far from perfect. The HDI is much harder to compute than the GDP, because on top of the GDP index, it must look at life expectancy and education. Just like the GDP, the data may be unreliable because it too looks at GDP. Moreover, although it is true that the HDI considers more aspects of human well-being than GDP, it still does not measure factors such as politics, gender equality, human freedom, or even the fundamental question of happiness. High levels of life expectancy, education, and GDP still do not necessarily add up to happiness. Nonetheless, GDP still has many more faults in reference to measuring progress. Apart from the one spoken of earlier, another problem is the social valuation of output in the country. For example, both a loaf of bread and a pack of cigarettes sell for $4 US dollars, that is, in Equatorial Guinea. GDP regards these two as having the same value for the country, but HDI realizes, or you could say that cigarettes are actually harming the country through negative externalities, which GDP ignores.
Well, don't forget to mention that it's also difficult to measure goods and services that are not reported. For example, that aren't produced and they don't give you a receipt. That means in formal calculations of a national income, there's an inadequate information to make the values credible. For example, it is extremely difficult to estimate the production of the service sector and leisure. How would one measure how much is produced from the output of a hospital? Another problem is the number of transactions that are either illegal or underground. So, for example, a piano teacher that receives a payment but does not give an accurate report of their income would cause the estimated national income to deviate from the true value, as there are values that are not being accounted for. As for illegal transactions, these transactions should be included in national income, but it is not because the incredible endeavors to track and record all of these transactions. Furthermore, the national income accounts and ignores the bads of the economy. This is saying that although the purchasing of more guns because of an imminent war will increase national income, it is not necessarily an increase in the economic welfare.
Also significant is the problem of double counting. This concept can be illustrated with the following simplified situation. Consider playing cards that are produced from the lumber mill which sells the lumber to a processing company, which sells the processed cardboard to a card production company, which then sells the card to the store, which in turn sells the card to the final consumer. The monetary value of the product at each stage already takes into account all the factors used before it, and so it is redundant to include all of the intermediate stages. In order to prevent double counting, calculations of national income are based only on the final market price of goods and services, and ignoring all intermediate prices.
Don't forget that not all hidden transactions are illegal. All goods and services produced in the subsistence or non-monetized sectors are also not accounted for in estimates of the national income. Goods and services produced at home, for example, are not accounted for in the calculation. These goods, which may be bartered or self-consumed, are also difficult to track and account for. For example, if a household grows their own vegetables and trades them to their neighbor for dog walking services, then the transaction would not be accounted for in the calculation of national income.
Well, now let's assume that the values are all accurate and that the economists have total information to calculate the true national income of the country. But does that necessarily say that the citizens have a better quality of living? An increase in work hours may lead to an increase in consumption and national income, but if it costs laborers their leisure time, are they actually better off? Could it be possible that a simple life is better than one that is more productive, but is also more stressful? This is a question that cannot be answered by the values of national income, and is one of the biggest flaws in the concept of national income.
Another problem with measuring the national income is that it only reflects the market price of the goods sold in the country. The value of items such as pencils and pens, when measured with the national income, are based on values sold in the stores. However, factor cost, the cost of the factors of production to produce the product, is not considered. Because taxes and subsidies extend the price of the goods, it often alters the true price that the seller wished to put the product on the market for. Therefore, factor cost is more effective to use when calculating the national income. However, the problem is we are not certain of the taxes on every product sold, as they do differ. When the data is released by Statistics Guinea, the data can be inaccurate since it does not accurately provide in that time period the actual change in exports and imports. This would affect the GDP and GDP per capita, either by estimating too high or too low. This leads to inaccuracy when determining whether a change in GDP per year is actually occurring. Also, even these numbers cannot be quantified fully. It is often an estimate, and therefore this measure is difficult to provide full evidence of the true GDP.
I had this other interview with another fellow from a different part of Equatorial Guinea, and trust me, it was very different than what I had heard from before from the other people in this documentary. So, what's your name?
Well, my name is Byron Vandy, and I live in Equatorial Guinea. You know, I have a small family of 3 people, and my father is quite rich.
So what does your father do exactly? What do you do?
Well, my father, you know, he does some oil stuff here and there, and he gives me money to spend wherever I want. I can buy whatever I want.
So, what do you currently think of the, living standards of Equatorial Guinea?
The living standards, huh? Well, this place is awesome. We have 4 cars in our family, and we have a driver that takes us everywhere we want. I don't know who could hate this place. It's like a paradise to me. We have everything I want. See this watch? $10,000 my father bought me. That's nothing though. I have computers. Woman. It's so easy.
But Byron, does it disturb you the poor people in Equatorial Guinea? Like, does it disturb you at all? Like, what do you think of?
But they live on the outside. It doesn't bother us. It's still a paradise for me. They all live in their little huts, and I'm in my nice house. I have a security guard, so they never disturb me. My family's we're living happily.
Have you ever tried to attack any?
Pardon?
Have you ever tried to attack any of the poor people?
Attack? Oh no, we don't bother with that. The servants do that. We throw rocks at them, just get them away.
Ever use knives? Ever use knives at all? Just try to gut them?
No problem, because we can easily bribe the government officials. I'm sure there are hundreds of them die, but it doesn't matter. They're poor, right? Like, it's no difference.
So, therefore, are we certain that the HDI is a good indicator of GDP or even GNP? No, we can't be certain that it is the perfect solution. However, we can still say that the HDI is superior to the GDP. The problem lies on so many factors and so many problems in the ways we collect and interpret things. In our current paradigm, for example, we assume that by having high standards, high GDP or GNP will follow. However, as seen today, there are often many discrepancies on how we collect things and how we count things, therefore skewing our own data.
Also not accounted for in estimates.
It's not that bad, man. It's okay. It doesn't have to be perfect, dude. It's okay. Trust me, man. That's okay.
Books are these? Yeah. Books?
Yeah.
Oh, these are from the...
We're just using it for the library. We'll put it back for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These are from library though.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you can take those when it comes out from the library.
No, it's just temporary. I'm not taking them home. We'll put them right back.
What's your suit number though?